It's June 30th, 2019, and the NBA is in the middle of one of the most iconic off seasons in league history. As highly recruited prospects Ja Morant and Zion Williamson headline the 2019 draft, a disgruntled Anthony Davis is attempting to force his way out of New Orleans, and a free agency class that was so talented that inherently the landscape of the NBA was going to be changed forever. As Kemba Walker took his talents to Boston, Jimmy Butler signed with Miami Heat, and Kawhi Leonard, who was just a few weeks removed from winning a championship and Finals MVP, was scoping out all of his options to determine where he would go next. And while the NBA world waited on that answer, Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant gave us all something to talk about, as both hyper-skilled scoring machines joined forces and signed with the Brooklyn Nets, forming one of the most impressive duos in the NBA. The star-studded pairing was immediately met with very lofty expectations, and this wasn't just because of the undeniable talent between Durant and Irving. With the landscape of the Eastern Conference, a very impressive supporting cast, and a respectable tangent of coaching and front office executives, one could easily argue as soon as Durant and Irving made it known that they were going to play in Brooklyn, it was viewed as a championship or bust move. And from the outside looking in, it seemed as if that was a challenge that not only both stars were willing to embrace, but did so with open arms. But unfortunately, they never came close to hitting the mark. Fast forward to where we are today, and the KD and Kyrie era in Brooklyn has peaked at a level of success that has amounted to a second round appearance. And what makes things even more disturbing is that it seems as if the pursuit of bringing a championship to Brooklyn has concluded, as the relationship between the two stars in the front office has soured so much so that it has resulted in Kevin Durant requesting a trade, despite us only being roughly a year removed from him receiving a contract extension. So, what exactly happened? Now, one would easily believe that adding Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving for any franchise should be an easy and simple process, but no, it wasn't. First, when it comes to Kevin Durant, it's important to know that just weeks before he signed with the Brooklyn Nets, he suffered an Achilles injury, keeping him sidelined for the next year of basketball. I bring this up not because I think it was a bad signing, it was a great decision by Brooklyn, a no-brainer, but because KD missing an extended amount of basketball within his tenure in Brooklyn became a reoccurring theme throughout these past 3 years. Not only that, many people like myself would assume that his athleticism regressing to the point where it's at right now had a lot to do with his injury as well, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Just remember, for year one, Kevin Durant is not playing because he's sidelined due to his Achilles injury. The next bit of nuance that I think a lot of people overlook is the DeAndre Jordan signing. At the time, the Brooklyn Nets signed the 31-year-old big man to a 4-year, $40 million contract, and this was certainly confusing to the masses, mainly because DJ in the 2 years prior had showed a lot of regression, so much so that any team that had aspirations of winning a championship definitely didn't have him at the top of their free agency list. And even if they were interested, signing him to a 4-year contract definitely was off the table. What made this decision even more head-scratching for the Brooklyn Nets is that they already had Jared Allen on their team, who at the time was a young center who showed a lot of promise in the prior year and had a very similar playing style to Jordan. And add on top of the fact that Allen was on a very manageable contract, and once more, one could only label this signing as a massive conundrum. However, it eventually became much more understanding once it was revealed that DeAndre Jordan had a great relationship with both Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. So yeah, good old nepotism never fails when you're adding star caliber talent on your roster. But somehow the biggest and somehow most forgotten factor during the 2019 offseason was Kyrie Irving. Now, at the time, Kyrie's talent was undeniable, easily one of the most versatile scorers in the NBA, extremely skilled, and had proven within his time in Boston and Cleveland that he was a great second option to a championship caliber team. But nevertheless, from a talent standpoint, there really wasn't that much questioning behind the addition of Kyrie Irving, but instead, there were a lot of questions with the baggage that came along with Kyrie on your team. Because while Kyrie was adding to his legacy in Boston and Cleveland, he also built a negative reputation across the league with his infamous mood swings that would result in him isolating himself amongst his teammates. And this is something that was witnessed in Brooklyn very early on, actually before the season even began. Now, it's not clear on what exactly triggered this episode. Some people cite visible frustration on Kyrie during a preseason trip to China, as he as an NBA athlete felt uncomfortable being in the middle of a situation that was perpetuated by other people in the NBA, such as Daryl Morey, with political issues between China and Hong Kong. While other people cite his resistance to put on a wearable during training camp with the Nets, which essentially is just a smart device that athletes put on their wrists that help analyze and detect certain body signals and vital signs when the athlete league is training and allows a team to gather data to best suit their training methods. Kyrie's hesitation stemmed from his concerns on what exactly the team was doing with that data and how they were using it and if they were selling it to other organizations. But regardless of what started it, several sources claim the end result was Kyrie not communicating with his teammates. Now, when given the opportunity, media members would ask Kevin Durant, does he see himself putting in any input on the potential concerns of Kyrie's behavior impacting the team, and more or less Durant felt like the best course of action from his end could be more of a hands-off approach, being quoted saying that he has all the intangibles that you would want in a teammate and a great player, but more importantly, respecting Kyrie's process of how he prepares himself before ball games. Now, some people could view this as support, while other people viewed it as enabling, and I'll leave that up to you. Now, in terms of Kyrie and how he responded when media members brought this to his attention, he more or less identified it as true, while also marginalizing the potential impact that this could have on his teammates by claiming that having mood swings is just the human being experience. Everyone has them, and that the media was blowing this way out of proportion. Which in some capacity is true, but definitely that argument wouldn't last long if the Nets started to struggle early on in the season, which unfortunately they did. In the first 11 games of the season, despite Kyrie putting up very respectable numbers, the Nets had a record of 4-7. And also during that time period, there were some concerns on how exactly the Nets offense was being ran, as Kenny Atkinson was quoted by saying, "We're not really running anything. We've kind of lost a little bit of our structure and organization." So yeah, like I stated before, very, very complex. And to make matters worse, it's about to become even more complicated, because after an 8-point loss against the Denver Nuggets, Kyrie would essentially be sidelined for the next 2 months of basketball, dealing with a shoulder injury. Now, within that time frame, to be fair to Kyrie, publicly he was very supportive of his teammates, which is something that a lot of people criticize him in his prior situations out in Cleveland and in Boston. So there seemed to have been some improvements and more effort from Kyrie to try to cultivate a relationship with some of his teammates. Now, after the near 2-month hiatus, Kyrie would eventually come back and play basketball, was active for a few games, but unfortunately the shoulder injury was persistent. And eventually Irving decided to opt in to get surgery on his shoulder, which unfortunately was season ending. Or at least that's what we thought. Look, I'm not going to spend that much time on the next part of the timeline because even though a lot of people want to think that it's important, it really isn't. But nevertheless, roughly a month and a half after Kyrie was ruled out for the rest of the season, COVID hit America really hard. The virus hit so hard that the NBA had no other choice but to suspend the season. After doing so in the upcoming months, NBA officials, players, and owners got together and had an ongoing conversation on how they should conclude the season. Now, when it comes to Kyrie, originally he was all for the idea of resuming the NBA season in a controlled environment, which we now know to be the bubble. And this was going to be huge for Brooklyn because despite Kevin Durant missing the entire season and Kyrie only being available for 20 games, the Brooklyn Nets were still able to stay afloat, so much so that they were contending for a playoff spot. Also, the ongoing dialogue had dragged on so long that Kyrie was able to make a full recovery from his surgery, which means that he would have been available to play in the bubble. However, Kyrie would eventually change his mind. Now, there are several reasons why he did so, but the biggest reason is because there was a subsection of NBA players who did not want to resume play, and they felt as if like their voice wasn't being properly heard. Because of this, Kyrie used his star power to elevate the voices of these players, and then went as far as to represent them in the conversations that the owners, players, and officials were having, and even went a step further to stand alongside them in solidarity and refuse to play in the NBA bubble once the season resumed. And if that wasn't enough, Kyrie was very open to the idea of going on strike against the NBA bubble due to racial injustice that was happening in America at that time. Now, the reason why I say this doesn't really matter because even if you were someone who was against Kyrie's actions, honestly, what exactly were you expecting if he were to play? Yes, it was cool that the Nets were able to stay afloat during Durant's and Irving's absence. However, even if Kyrie came back and played for the Brooklyn Nets in a bubble, a first-round exit is their ceiling, which is what happened anyway. So again, who really cares? But the biggest reason why I say this doesn't really matter is because when all of this was occurring, no one was really talking about the fact that the Brooklyn Nets fired their head coach Kenny Atkinson, which was a much bigger and more important story that was going on with the Brooklyn Nets at that time. Which is a great transition into year 2. Now, during the 2020 offseason, there are 2 major events that occurred. The first one being the firing of Kenny Atkinson. Now, as many of us know, when a head coach gets fired, everyone in the organization is attempting to absolve themselves from the responsibility. However, there is a lot of information pointing to Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving at bare minimum having major influence on the decision to fire Kenny Atkinson, as well as hiring his replacement. From an organizational standpoint, it doesn't really make any sense for the Brooklyn Nets to change their head coach. Atkinson had been with the organization before KD and Kyrie were there, and while doing so, he breeded a winning culture for an organization with a bunch of young players that were still on the team. And even in the past season, while Durant missed the entire year and Kyrie only played 20 games, he was still able to coach his team to a playoff berth, which then adds even more validity, pointing to Durant and Irving's influence on this decision. And during the summer, while the speculation was peaking, of course Durant and Irving addressed this, and while doing so, marginalizing their potential impact on the decision to fire their head coach. But also while doing so, Kyrie, for whatever reason, seemed it necessary to highlight the things that he felt that he needed from a head coach, almost implying that it was lacking or not being provided by Kenny Atkinson.
Kenny was great for the group that he served, and I was very appreciative of what he was giving us throughout the season when we were playing. We don't need somebody to come in and put their coaching philosophy on everything that we're doing and change up the wheel and, yo, you guys need to start doing this. And we start running on the first day of practice. It's just like, no.
Now, even if you were to be optimistic on Kyrie's end, you would then assume that if Kenny Atkinson was lacking in any way, that the replacement for him would be someone who had the experience to prove that he had the ability to lead this team to a championship. But unfortunately, it wasn't, because to replace Kenny Atkinson was all-time great point guard Steve Nash, who had zero experience. To make matters worse, it's not as if like the Nets were forced to choose Steve Nash due to lack of options, because there were indeed several coaches who had the experience, and actually some of them they hired as assistants in Mike D'Antoni and Ime Udoka. So it's certainly head-scratching until it's revealed that Durant and Nash had cultivated a relationship within Durant's time as a Warrior. And as we already know, Brooklyn is more than willing to make decisions based off of nepotism that favor KD and Kyrie, for example, the DeAndre Jordan signing. So yeah, a lot of signs pointing to this direction, but I want to be clear, these are all allegations and rumors, and I'm just connecting the dots. Which then brings us to the second major event, and that is recruiting James Harden. Now, once more, I want to be clear, this is a lot of speculation, a lot of rumors, even more so than the coaching situation, so keep that in mind. However, rumor has it during an event in Las Vegas, Durant approached Harden and attempted to persuade him to force his way out of Houston. Now, of course, as we all know, later on down the timeline, Harden would eventually do this, so hindsight could be 2020, but even in the moment, it's not that far-fetched to believe that this is true. Because when you put things into proper context, it still makes a lot of sense. The Rockets, from an organizational standpoint, were making a lot of changes. They decided to part ways with the general manager and Daryl Morey and head coach and Mike D'Antoni. Also, in the same offseason, they traded Westbrook, and what they got in return really wasn't much of anything. And many people like myself felt like the Rockets were moving further away from being a title contending team. And with all that going on, Harden being 31 years old with 2 years left on his contract, yeah, it makes a lot of sense for this conversation to be had. Now, to be fair to Harden, at this point in the timeline, he had not yet requested to be traded, but he would do so just a few weeks later. As roughly 15 games in the regular season, Harden was now a Brooklyn Net. And what Brooklyn gave up in return was a massive haul. Now, I'm not going to highlight every single last piece that was traded because it was a lot of moving parts, but the three biggest pieces that Brooklyn lost in this trade were Jared Allen, Karis LeVert, and a lot of draft compensation. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is it that Brooklyn gave up this much if when they went into trade talks with Houston, they had all of the leverage? Well, that's where things become a little bit more problematic. Partially because the Nets were competing with the Philadelphia 76ers trade package that was headlined by Ben Simmons and a bunch of draft picks as well. But more importantly, there are claims that Durant was pushing for this trade really hard. And the reason why he was doing so is not only because he wanted Harden, but also because Brooklyn was pretty desperate at that time. Despite all the hype surrounding this team, when Harden was traded to the Nets, they had a record of 7-6. Spencer Dinwiddie was ruled out for the remainder of the year after tearing his ACL in the third game of the season. Kevin Durant had missed some games due to COVID protocol. And oh yeah, Kyrie just disappeared for 2 weeks straight. It was later revealed that he was dealing with family business, but the fact that he disappeared and no one in the organization knew where he was at was definitely problematic. So it is pretty easy to believe that the front office out in Brooklyn felt the pressure, regardless if it was directly from Kevin Durant or not. Now, when the Nets did pull off the trade, there were a lot of optimism surrounding the team that they were going to have the ability to turn the season around by the end of the year. And they basically did so. When the regular season was over, the Nets had a record of 48-24, which was the second best record in the Eastern Conference. They had the #1 ranked offense, and the three stars were putting up ridiculous numbers. And what stood out even more is that the Nets were able to accomplish this despite the fact that their big three barely played together throughout the remainder of the year, as both Durant and Harden missed substantial time throughout the regular season dealing with hamstring injuries. And oh yeah, almost forgot, Kyrie did take another break in the middle of the season, but this time he gave his team team a heads up, so it wasn't considered a disappearing act when he was dealing with some more family matters. Because of these factors, Harden, Irving, and Durant only played 10 games alongside one another. And with the limited reps, there was some skepticism on if the big three were going to be able to translate their elite level play into the postseason, but that didn't last long. In the first round, Brooklyn eviscerated the Boston Celtics, and while doing so, Durant, Irving, and Harden put up amazing numbers. So heading into the second round, many people looked at the Brooklyn Nets as a legitimate title contender, but this is where everything unfortunately falls apart. Literally, the first possession in the second round against the Milwaukee Bucks, James Harden sprains his hamstring. 3 games later, after taking a 2-1 lead, Kyrie falls awkwardly on Giannis's foot, spraining his ankle and keeping him sidelined for the remainder of the series. But even with that occurring, the Nets still were able to push the series to 7 games, largely because of a historic performance from Kevin Durant in Game 5, but then they came up short because KD's big toe was too long, as his foot was on the line during a series-defining shot, as Game 7 unfortunately was pushed into overtime instead of Brooklyn winning that game. And in OT, it was clear that Durant was gassed as he struggled to make a shot, allowing Milwaukee to walk away with the series victory. Now, many people could look at this season as a failure, as the Brooklyn Nets and their big three were not able to raise a Larry O'Brien trophy at the end of the year. However, many people decided to opt into more of a glass half full mentality, as the Nets proved that they had the ability to be one of the better teams in the conference despite not even having their big three together throughout the entire season. They also provided enough evidence that even though they were not able to play defense at an elite level, they were still able to win games routinely just off of their sheer offensive power. But the biggest takeaway is that Brooklyn was able to push the inevitable champions in the Milwaukee Bucks to 7 games, even though both Kyrie and James Harden were dealing with injuries. So heading into the following year, it's very clear on why so many people thought highly of Brooklyn, but unfortunately, that level of optimism did not last long. So during the 21 offseason, there were a lot of things that occurred that I think a lot of people may have overlooked. The first one being that Brooklyn made some changes to their roster that went under the radar, but later on would have lasting impact. Those changes being parting ways with Landry Shamet, Spencer Dinwiddie, and DeAndre Jordan. Now, even though there isn't any clear evidence of this, it's heavily implied that the reason why the front office decided to go in this direction is just to save themselves financially. And the biggest indicator of this is how they dealt with DeAndre Jordan, because DJ was on such a bad contract that the only way that the Brooklyn Nets could move off of him is if they gave up 4 second-round picks in the process, which is a massive blow for an organization that just gave up a lot of draft capital during the Harden transaction. And even though, yes, these players were replaced by other individuals, it is undeniable that there was a drop-off in talent, which meant that a team that was already pretty thin became even more dependent on their big three. The second thing that occurred is losing both Mike D'Antoni and Ime Udoka, which raised a lot of red flags to people who follow this team very closely, because there was a real belief that the entire identity of the Nets in the previous season was heavily influenced off D'Antoni and Udoka and not Steve Nash. But the biggest thing and the most impactful factor to the Brooklyn Nets was Kyrie not being vaccinated. As the NBA adjusted into a new rule that consisted of COVID, so did the rest of the country. And by doing so, some states made it mandatory for individuals to be vaccinated if they wanted to participate in public events. Now, for most teams in the league, this really wasn't that big of a deal, not only because an overwhelming majority of players were already vaccinated, but also there were only a handful of states that were willing to carry out a mandate. But unfortunately for Brooklyn, they definitely ended up with a short end of the stick, as New York was one of the few states that implemented a mandate, while also Kyrie being one of the very few players in the league that refused to be vaccinated. Because of this, Kyrie was only allowed to play away games in cities and states that did not mandate him to be vaccinated, which effectively made him a part-time player, a concept that the Brooklyn Nets from an organizational standpoint agreed upon originally, but later on into the offseason, they eventually changed their mind.
What would you do? If you felt uncomfortable going into the season, when you were promised that you would have exemptions or that you didn't have to be forced to get the vaccine. This wasn't an issue before the season started. This wasn't something that I foresaw coming, where I prepared for it. And, I had a chance to strategize on what was going to be best for me and my family.
But looking at a much bigger scope of this, the Nets electing to not have Kyrie be a part-time player was way more detrimental to the team than I think a lot of people were willing to admit at the time. Because like I stated earlier, this was already a team that was pretty thin, that became even more dependent on their star caliber players, that just lost one of their stars, and another one in James Harden just got done playing through a season-ending hamstring injury during the playoffs, so it wasn't sure if he was going to be 100% by the start of the season. And from the looks of things, it seemed as if the latter was true, as Harden in the first 10 games of the season was far removed from the star caliber player that we once knew him from and was posting up pedestrian numbers at best. To make matters worse, 4 games later, Joe Harris would deal with an ankle injury that originally was only going to keep him out for roughly a month or two, but then later into the timeline, it was unfortunately revealed that he was going to miss the entire season, which put even more weight on the shoulders of Durant and Harden. Now, on one hand, there were still people who looked at this through a more optimistic lens. The result of these factors led to Kevin Durant posting up amazing numbers while still leading the Nets to a very respectable seeding in the Eastern Conference, easily making Durant a frontrunner in the MVP conversation. However, on the other hand, there were several people who were concerned with the amount of minutes that Harden and Durant were logging in, as both stars would have a string of games where they would put in 37 plus minutes of action on a game-to-game basis. And unfortunately, it didn't get better. As the season continued to progress, there were a few Nets players that missed some time, making the load that Harden and Durant was carrying even larger. And when there were games where Durant and Harden did not play, the supporting cast surrounding the other star was miserable. And while all of this is happening, there were some reports claiming that Kyrie had little to no contact with the organization. Because of these factors, as well as some potential internal frustrations, questions of sustainability became much more valid. And with those raised concerns, it forced the front office out in Brooklyn to change their mind on Kyrie and allow him to be a part-time player. This was not only good news because the Nets clearly needed the star caliber player to come back, but also this gave the opportunity for both Durant and Harden to miss a few games due to rest because they definitely needed it. Unfortunately though, that ideology wouldn't last long, because just 10 days after Kyrie was cleared to be a part-time player, Kevin Durant would go down with an MCL injury, keeping him sidelined for the inevitable future, which essentially put the Nets right back in the situation that they were before. And one could easily argue that it's actually worse, as Kyrie being a part-time player means that he was not available to play during home games, which put even more weight on the shoulders of Harden than it was earlier in the year. And with Durant out and Kyrie being part-time, the Nets started to plummet in the standings. And with the weight of the responsibility of Harden having to lead this franchise without his 2 co-stars, it quickly manifested into frustration, which we now know resulted in Harden getting traded. Now, to this day, it's not 100% sure on why exactly James Harden demanded to be traded. Obviously, there are several rumors surrounding the internal drama, but to be quite frank, a lot of them just don't make that much sense, outside of the possibility that Harden was extremely disappointed on how his teammates, Kyrie, and the front office dealt with the whole COVID mandate situation. As rumor has it, Harden felt as if his co-star should have sacrificed and taken the vaccine, similar to what he did in the playoffs when he sacrificed his body by playing through a sprained hamstring injury. And internally, there seemed to have been some disagreement with Harden and Kyrie, and that disagreement was led by Kevin Durant, who believed vehemently that the team should support Kyrie's decision and that the real problem were the front office execs who changed their minds and a mandate that quite honestly just didn't make any sense. And yes, I know Harden has been on record by claiming that he had no problem with Kyrie at all, but as we all know through James Harden's career, the story that he tells in the media doesn't necessarily align with what actually occurred in reality. Nevertheless, Brooklyn eventually traded James Harden to the Philadelphia 76ers, who at the time quite honestly had the best trade package to offer for Harden, especially since he was on an expiring contract and wasn't having the greatest season of his career. So in return, Brooklyn received Seth Curry, Andre Drummond, 2 first-round picks, and Ben Simmons. Now at the time, because how poor Harden was playing, there was still some optimism for the return that Brooklyn received to be a bit of an upgrade from what they had before. Seth Curry being a sharpshooter that would have replaced Joe Harris into the lineup since he was out for the remainder of the year, Drummond giving them some size inside that they desperately needed, and then you had Ben Simmons, who was going to be able to give you some of the better attributes from James Harden with his playmaking, while also having some elite level impact on the defensive end of the floor, but it just wasn't that simple. In this moment of the season, Ben Simmons had not played a single minute for the Philadelphia 76ers, mainly because of some of the grievance that he had with some of his teammates, coaches, and front office staff members out in Philly, but also Simmons was dealing with a nagging back injury that would be later revealed to be a bit more severe than I think a lot of people anticipated. And because of that injury, even when Simmons was traded to Brooklyn, he still did not play. And actually, I can spoil a little bit for you, Simmons doesn't play at all for the remainder of the season, including the playoffs. So yeah, looking back at this trade, it definitely wasn't that favorable for Brooklyn at all. So with Kyrie only being a part-time player, Kevin Durant still trying to return from an MCL injury, and Ben Simmons not playing at all, The little bit of winning that the Nets were doing before the Harden trade basically evaporated. In the beginning of January, the Nets had a record of 23-12 and were at the top of the conference, but just 2 months later, the Nets were a 500 ball club struggling to secure a playoff spot. Now, Durant would eventually come back from his MCL injury, logging a bunch of minutes before the regular season concluded, and New York ended the mandate, which allowed Kyrie to go back to being a full-time player. But unfortunately, it was just too little too late, as the Brooklyn Nets finished the 2022 regular season just a few games above 500 with the 7th seed. They were able to beat Cleveland in the play-in tournament, which secured them a playoff spot, but in the playoffs, it was very clear that a team that had aspirations to win a championship was very far removed from hitting the mark, as Brooklyn was swept in the first round by the Boston Celtics, and in the process, the star-studded offensive duo struggled tremendously to be consistent in the 4 games. Which more or less brings us to where we are today. In the beginning stages of the offseason, Kyrie and the front office sat down to discuss a contract extension. Now, normally a player of Kyrie's caliber would definitely receive a fully guaranteed max contract. However, with the amount of games that Kyrie missed over the past 3 years, as well as some off-court discrepancies that might have left some front office execs out in Brooklyn a little uneasy, Brooklyn believed that they found a happy medium by giving Kyrie a max contract, but it was only going to be fully guaranteed if he met certain contingencies. In response, Kyrie declined the offer, and some rumors went as far as to state that he viewed it as disrespectful and undermining his talent as a basketball player. Because of this, Kyrie would hit the open market, hopefully find a suitor so he can gain leverage in negotiations between the Brooklyn Nets and himself, but unfortunately failed to do so, which left him no choice but to opt into his last year of his contract and become a free agent in the following offseason. And with the potential result of Kyrie no longer being a Brooklyn Net within a year's amount of time, pandemonium hit the Brooklyn Nets fan base pretty hard, but it hit even harder just a few days later once Kevin Durant officially requested to be traded from the team. So yeah, the Brooklyn Nets basically went from a title contending team to a potential full rebuild within the matter of 8 months. Now you may be asking yourself what exactly is going on today, and honestly, I don't even know. The NBA world sits on ice as we all await either a Woj or Shambomb updating us on some credible information on the Kevin Durant trade. And in this past month, there honestly hasn't been anything pressing at all. Trade rumors, asset management, and a bunch of false reports that have left many people like myself believing that Kevin Durant more than likely will still be a Brooklyn Net by the beginning of this next season. And also for people out there who are wondering why exactly did Kevin Durant make this trade, up until now, it's a bunch of speculation. Many people believe that he made the formal request just to help Kyrie get some leverage in contract negotiations later on down the line, while on the other hand, many people like myself believe that Kevin Durant isn't sold on the idea that the Brooklyn Nets could truly compete for a championship, and really looking at their chances of contending for a title through a critical lens, and has more or less came to the conclusion that he's possibly made a massive mistake and just wants to get ahead of everything before it falls apart. But regardless of what happens, it is undeniable that the Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving era out in Brooklyn has fell miserably short. Anyway, with all the information that you have gathered in this video, please let me know, why do you believe Kevin Durant is requesting a trade out of Brooklyn? And hopefully we can get some more news about this at the end of the week. Now, once that does occur, you more than likely will not see me on this channel, but I will be on my second channel breaking some news and other NBA content throughout the rest of the summer, so make sure you go follow me over there. And finally, this video took a very long time to gather all this information, so I want to give a huge shout out to Classy, No Layup, Trey, Ash, and NMZ for helping me gather as much information as possible. Make sure you go follow them. Their links will be in the description. And also, if you could please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, because yeah, this video took a really long time. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.